Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Muhammad Laiq Siddiqui, the father of Holophase. You have just walked through 64 parts. That is not a small thing. It is not content, it is infrastructure. Episode 11 is the part of the Holophase journey where we do something most humans avoid. We build a discipline strong enough to protect truth from us. Because the greatest danger to science is not ignorance, it is confidence without license. It is the human habit of taking a beautiful idea, or a popular consensus, or an elegant equation, and treating it as reality without asking the only question that matters. Has this rule earned the right to be believed? Episode 11 answers that question by giving science a firewall. Not a wall that blocks inquiry, but a compass that keeps inquiry sane. And here are the two axioms that pulse through every single part of this episode, like a heartbeat that never stops. Rules do not become real by elegance, consensus, or tradition. They earn a license only by surviving falsification, variation, independence, and scope discipline. And when a rule fails, we do not believe harder. We tighten, downgrade, or retire its license. If you remember nothing else from episode 11, remember those two sentences. They are the spine. Now I will weave the entire episode into one coherent picture. A simple story, but not entertainment. A story that functions like an engineering diagram in your mind. Imagine Afghanistan's mountains in the early morning, when the ridges are sharp and the air is cold. A river begins as snowmelt high above, then gathers into streams, then becomes a strong current in the valley that can be heard before it is seen. If you stand at one crossing point, you might think you understand the river. It is here, it flows like this, it is safe. But walk a few kilometers, or return in a different season, and you learn the deeper truth. The river is the same river, yet the conditions change. The bank collapses after storms. A narrow pass can fill with ice. What was safe last month can be deadly today. The land is real, but your claim about the land always has scope. Science fails for the same reason travelers drown. Not because they have no map, but because they worship the map. Episode 11 teaches a new habit. Keep the map, but never confuse it with the ground. The firewall is the set of practices that keeps the map honest. To build that habit, episode 11 begins with a basic stack of description. Part 1. A phi sentence. A phi sentence is not a theory. It is a measured statement. Within a declared window, our instruments compared phase and produced a record. You can hear it as phi of x and t, meaning phi as a function of position and time. A sentence is what the lantern shows inside its circle of light. What happened here, now, as measured. Part 2. A grammar. A grammar is not a sentence. It is a constraint on sentences. It says which phi sentences are admissible and which are forbidden. Grammar is the invisible rulebook that makes some patterns possible and others impossible. Grammar is the difference between a bird flew and a bird can fly because the world allows lift, momentum, and stable motion. Grammar is the world's admissibility structure. Part 3. Metagrammar. Metagrammar is the rule about rules. It answers, how do we write the rule cleanly, test it honestly, certify it responsibly, and retire it without shame? Metagrammar is not about what is. It is about how we can safely find out what is. Now the episode delivers its first shock. Not all constraints are equal. If you confuse types of constraints, you can destroy science while thinking you are doing it. Some constraints are logical. A rule cannot contradict itself. Some are ontological. In Holophase, we are phi closed. We do not introduce new primitives to patch gaps. Some are operational. If a claim cannot be measured, it cannot be licensed. Some are empirical. Repeatability and falsifiability are not optional decorations. They are admission requirements. Some are conventional. Choices we declare openly, like coordinate gauges and canonical forms, so we do not mistake our choices for nature. Some are about uncertainty. Every rule has a stability radius. Beyond it, its license expires. Some are about independence. A rule must not be a trick of one sensor or one pipeline. Some are about representation. A truth should not vanish when we change coordinate descriptions. This is why the firewall always begins with a simple question. What kind of rule is this? A person who cannot ask that question is vulnerable to elegant nonsense. Next, episode 11 turns rules into objects that can be audited. This is where science becomes a registry, not a rumor. A rule must be written in a meta-language. It must come with proof obligations. What must be shown before the rule is admissible? It must type check. Symbols must mean what they claim to mean. It must belong to a model class. We must know what family of grammars we are in, what assumptions we have made, and what we have forbidden. Why is this necessary? Because without a meta-language, rules are slippery. People can move goalposts without noticing. They can smuggle assumptions in the back door. They can call a convention a law. The firewall insists, if a rule is real, it must be describable in a way that other minds can check. Then, episode 11 asks the hardest practical question. How do you infer a grammar from many sentences without overfitting and calling it reality? We collect many phi sentences across many windows. We look for a minimal grammar, the smallest constraint that explains the admissible pattern without unnecessary degrees of freedom. We do complexity accounting. How many knobs did we tune? We extract tacit assumptions. What did we quietly assume because it felt obvious? We distinguish patchwise rules from global rules. A rule that holds in one valley may not hold across the whole mountain range. We build scope objects and applicability gates, explicitly, where it works and where it does not. We face identifiability limits honestly. Some parameters cannot be uniquely inferred from available data. And we detect fossil constraints, patterns that look like law, but are frozen accidents of history or sampling. This arc saves science from its most seductive sin, mistaking a convenient fit for a necessary truth. Now episode 11 confronts causality. Correlation is cheap. Law is expensive. A causal constraint is not the same as a correlational pattern. Confounding can create fake laws, especially when we aggregate windows. So the firewall uses conservative causal doctrine. Minimal interventions, careful control, and explicit honesty about causal direction when data cannot identify it. Sometimes you can say, these move together. Sometimes you cannot say, this causes that. The firewall would rather be humble than wrong. Then the immune system arrives. Meta-falsification. A sentence can be false without the rule being false. A single measurement can be noisy. A sensor can drift. A pipeline can have bias. So the firewall distinguishes falsifying a sentence from falsifying a rule. To falsify a rule responsibly, we need structured checks, cross-pipeline inconsistency audits, regime breakdown detection, misspecification diagnostics, metagates that test the testing system, negative controls and placebo laws that should not discover structure, disagreement resolution protocols so conflict becomes data, not tribal war. We test inference chain robustness. The whole pipeline must be audited. we test out-of-distribution generalization. Does the rule survive beyond its training regime? And we detect tautologies. If a rule cannot fail, it is not science. This is the heart of the firewall. It is an immune system against self-deception. But the firewall goes further, because humans do not only deceive themselves by accident, they can also game metrics on purpose. Once a rule becomes valuable, socially, financially, culturally, people optimize the metric rather than the truth. They good-heart it. They fake compliance. They discover ways to pass shallow tests without being right. So episode 11 demands adversarial science. Assume a clever opponent exists. Stress test rules. Probe brittleness. Measure stability. Truth must survive intelligent opposition, not just friendly confirmation. Then comes the boundary, the unwritable. Holophase treats limits as operational, not mystical. Unwritable means, within current feasible measurement and inference, no finite admissible grammar can be licensed that captures the phenomenon without breaking scope discipline or falsifiability. But we must distinguish apparent unwritability, where better data or better encoders might help, from genuine unwritability, where the boundary survives siege testing. The firewall teaches siege testing of boundaries, silence as information, and negative result archiving. Now, episode 11 lifts its gaze from individual labs to civilization. Rules must persist across scales and across generations. So we study why rules persist, how scale stability is tested, and how canonicalization works. We build canonical rule forms so the same law can be recognized even when written differently. We define grammar equivalence classes and invariants, what remains the same under transformations. We build archives and registries so knowledge does not live in fragile memory. We add certification labels, the rule's scope, uncertainty, and license grade. We track rule identity and lineage, how a rule evolved over time. We maintain counterexample and anomaly registries. The shadow archive becomes part of the official memory. We design cross-civilization validation. A truth must not depend on one tribe. And we close the meta loop. The firewall audits itself, evolves by explicit triggers, and builds heuristics for detecting unknown unknowns. This arc is the difference between a clever culture and a durable civilization. Finally, the episode locks into its last 5 parts, the kernel and the frontier. Part 60, the validated kernel. This is the registry of rules that have earned licenses in declared scopes with declared uncertainties and declared falsifiers. The kernel is not everything. It is what we can safely build with. Part 61. Incompleteness, operationalized. Here we face a deep fact. No finite grammar gives total closure. There will always be boundaries, trade-offs, undecidable zones within any given family of admissible rules. Part 62. Implications of incompleteness. Incompleteness is not weakness. It is the guarantee that science stays open, revisable, and resistant to dogma. A science that denies limits becomes brittle ideology. A science that maps limits becomes robust. Part 63. The license to interpret. Knowledge must be used, taught, and communicated. Interpretation is allowed, but only under license. You must declare which grammar you are using, where it applies, what uncertainty remains, and what falsifies it. Interpretation without these labels is where ideology sneaks back in. Part 64. The Eternal Frontier and Invitation. The firewall persists as a compass, not a wall. Episode 11 does not end inquiry, it makes inquiry safe. The listener is invited to participate, to measure honestly, declare scope, track uncertainty, respect the firewall, and evolve the method without corrupting it. All of this remains inside the holophase lens. Reality is phi and its derivatives. The triunity is never separable. Omega, K, and nu must be reconstructed together, from phi, under license. Energy is tally only, bookkeeping of coherence and mismatch, never a substance, never a cause, never an idol. Now I will give you the crystal picture that ties everything together. Imagine again that Afghan valley. A traveler wants to cross the river and continue toward the next mountains. He cannot do it by faith. He needs a method. First, he uses the lantern. 5 sentences. He records what the water is doing here and now. Second, he uses the map, grammar. He uses rules that have worked before, but he treats them as scoped. Third, he consults the inspector, metagrammar. The inspector checks whether the map is being used inside its license. The inspector asks, is this a logical rule, an ontological constraint, an operational feasibility, an empirical license, or a convention? The inspector asks, what assumptions are you hiding? The inspector asks, what would make you turn back? The inspector asks, is your confidence honest or performed? The traveler learns a discipline. When the river shifts, do not argue with the river. Update the map, narrow the claim, archive the failure, improve the measurement, or propose a new route, but only if it can be tested. This is episode 11 in one living image. Science as a disciplined crossing of reality, where the firewall prevents drowning in our own certainty. So what did you gain by walking through all 64 parts? You gain the ability to hear a claim and immediately ask the questions that protect sanity. What is the sentence? What is the grammar? What is the meta-grammar? What kind of constraint is this? What is the scope? What is the uncertainty? What is the falsifier? Where is the anomaly archive? Where is the frontier? You gain the ability to say, without shame and without collapse, not licensed here, and to mean it as strength. And you gain the final posture, participation without ownership. You are invited to join the method, not worship the words. Before we go further, let me make the symbols feel like ordinary speech. When I say phi, I mean the phase field, the cyclic quantity that wraps around like a circle. When I say omega, I mean the time rate of phi, how fast phi is turning with time. Spoken plainly, omega is the rhythm. When I say k, I mean the spatial rate of phi, how quickly phi changes as you move through space. Spoken plainly, k is the structure. And when I say nu, I mean motion, how patterns propagate and couple through that structure. The traveling, the carrying, the transforming. A simple set of relations, spoken carefully, is phi of x and t, phi as a function of position x and time t. Omega equals d phi over dt, the time derivative of phi. K equals grad phi, the spatial gradient of phi. And in the simplest wave regime, nu equals omega divided by k. Each of these is not a metaphysical claim. It is a description you may use only inside a licensed scope. Episode 11 trains you to speak these relations with humility, not with worship. Now, what is a licensed window? Imagine you take a photograph. The frame is your window. It covers a certain region of space, a certain duration of time, and it captures motion only up to a certain blur limit. Every measurement in the real world is like that. You do not measure the universe. you measure within a window. So a phi sentence always carries a window label, even if the old culture forgot to say it out loud. Episode 11 forces you to say it. And what is uncertainty? Uncertainty is not an apology. It is a number attached to your claim that tells the listener how far the claim can stretch before it becomes dishonest. If I say, the river is 2 meters deep, but I did not measure carefully, that sentence is dangerous. If I say, the river is around 2 meters deep, plus or minus half a meter, measured at this point at this hour, that sentence becomes usable. In Holophase, every rule must carry this kind of usable uncertainty. This is why the firewall feels like engineering, not philosophy. It is closer to a bridge inspector than to a poet. Consider a bridge across a river in a mountain valley. A responsible bridge has a sign: maximum load, wind limits, maintenance date, and what conditions close the crossing. That sign is scope, uncertainty, and falsification in everyday form. A bridge with no sign is not brave, it is reckless. A theory with no scope, no uncertainty, and no falsifier is the same. It is a bridge without a load limit sign. Episode 11 is the part of Holophase where we insist that every knowledge bridge must have a sign. In the fourth arc, Inference, the firewall fights a particular enemy, the frozen accident. A frozen accident is a pattern that exists only because of how history happened, not because it is a deep constraint of phi. For example, if you walk one particular mountain trail, you may think the path always turns left around the boulder. But that is not a law of mountains. It is a local feature. A different valley has a different trail. Episode 11 teaches you to ask, is this rule global or patchwise? And if it is patchwise, we do not shame it. We label it honestly. In the causal arc, the firewall does something brave. It refuses to pretend. Many fields are tempted to claim causation because the human mind craves a cause. But the firewall requires that cause be earned. If you cannot identify causal direction, you must say so. If you can only say these correlate, then that is what you say. This is not weakness. It is honesty that protects the whole structure from collapse later. Negative controls and placebo laws make the firewall even sharper. A negative control is a test where the rule should not appear. If your method detects a law in pure noise, your method is broken. A placebo law is a fake constraint you invent to see if the system will mistakenly certify it. A healthy firewall rejects placebo laws. This is how we prevent self-deception masquerading as discovery. The out-of-distribution test is similar. If a rule is only true in the conditions you trained it on, it might be an overfit. The firewall says, take it to a new valley, a new regime, and see whether it holds within its declared scope. If it fails, you do not panic. You narrow its scope. A narrow truth is still valuable. A universal claim that fails is dangerous. Now consider the adversarial arc. This arc is painful because it admits that human institutions are not pure. If a rule becomes a target for funding, for status, for control, people will learn to game the tests. Episode 11 forces science to grow teeth. It demands adversarial testing. We try to break our own rules, the way a security team tries to break a system before an attacker does. A rule that survives friendly testing is a beginner. A rule that survives adversarial testing is mature. Then we arrive at the unwritable. This is where the firewall teaches a new kind of courage, the courage to let silence speak. If a phenomenon resists all admissible grammars, we do not fill the gap with metaphysics. We archive the negative result. We label the boundary. We siege test again. If the boundary persists, the boundary becomes part of knowledge. The frontier is not failure. it is information. Now the kernel and frontier lock. The validated kernel is the set of rules that engineers can safely use. But the kernel is not worshipped. It is maintained. It is audited. It is revised. And above all, it is paired with its shadow archive, the record of anomalies, near misses, failures, and regime breakdowns. A kernel without a shadow archive is dogma. A shadow archive without a kernel is chaos. A mature field holds both. And finally, we meet the eternal frontier. The frontier is where the method admits. Inside this grammar family, certain questions remain undecidable or trade-off constrained. But this does not weaken science. It saves it from becoming religion. This is where the invitation becomes personal. You, the listener, are invited to participate without ownership. That means you can contribute measurements, analysis, encoders, and tests. You can propose grammars. You can help audit scope and uncertainty. But you may not claim final truth. You may not shut down inquiry by authority. You may not pretend your favorite map is the ground. To make this invitation practical, episode 11 gives you a simple 4-question audit you can use anywhere: in physics, in medicine, in economics, in daily claims. 1. What is the rule exactly? 2. What is the scope? Where does it apply? 3. What is the uncertainty? How sure is it? 4. What is the falsifier? What would make us revise it? If these 4 answers are missing, you are not hearing a license claim. You might be hearing exploration, opinion, marketing, or ideology. Now, let me tie the triunity to this audit, because holophase is always omega, k, and nu together. When someone claims a rule, ask, what does it say about omega, the rhythm over time? What does it say about k, the structure in space? What does it say about nu, the motion and coupling? If someone speaks in one dimension only, they are often hiding a gap. The firewall insists that the 3 shadows be reconstructed together, because reality itself expresses them together. And remember the demotion rule. Energy is tally only. In practice, this means we treat energy like a ledger that summarizes constraints. When omega, k, and nu reconstructions remain coherent, the ledger balances. When they do not, we do not invent a substance to explain the mismatch. We treat the mismatch as a sign. Either the scope was wrong, the uncertainty was underreported, or the grammar is incomplete for this regime. Energy, as tally, becomes a diagnostic tool, not a metaphysical idol. So what is the one crystal picture of episode 11? It is this. Science is not a pile of facts. It is a living language that must be defended from corruption. The firewall is the defense. It is the discipline that turns curiosity into reliable knowledge and turns human weakness into a manageable risk instead of a fatal flaw. With the firewall complete, we are finally ready for cosmogenesis. Not as myth, not as entertainment, but as derivation under license. And we end exactly where we began, with phi and with humility. Rules do not become real by elegance, consensus, or tradition. They earn a license only by surviving falsification, variation, independence, and scope discipline. When a rule fails, we do not believe harder. We tighten, downgrade, or retire its license. If you want to see the full mathematical derivations and exact equations behind this idea, you can search for Holophase on Zenodo. There you will find the scientific papers that this audio journey is built on. Salam and peace be upon you.